Good to see everybody this evening. Hope that you had a good day today. Personally, I think I've had about the roughest 2 weeks of my entire life, so I'm hoping things turn with the weather. We're in Acts and getting into, Paul's trial, and as we get into, we'll get down here in a minute. As we get into these arguments that Paul starts to make, this idea of Gentiles, we got into this, all the Jews that believed in Paul, they're going to be upset. They're zealous for the law. Jews who are faithful to Christ, but they're zealous for the law. How are we going to do that? Present Paul to them. So the solution was to put Paul to the temple to complete a Nazirite vow. And we talked about that last week. And by that, the Jews would accept Paul, say, well, you're a Christian, you're Jewish, you're still keeping the law, you're still keeping those things that, you should keep because they've still bound the law, even though they were Christians. But then, of course, they accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple court, and they arrested him. They come with him in a mob. The Romans intercede, and they take him, and they basically protect him. The Roman soldiers are protecting him, and it gets down to this point where he's making this defense to the people. He's speaking in Aramaic. He's making a defense. He talks about his stoning of Stephen, how he agreed with that because that's where he was. But he also said, the Lord says, I'll send you to the Gentiles. And of course, at that, they became upset. And we talked about this last week. They threw dust in the air. They threw off their cloaks. The commander took him to be flogged and questioned. They stretched him to flog him, and Paul says it's illegal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty. When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported, what are you going to do? He asked, this man is a Roman citizen. So Paul kind of plays a trump card here, right? He's been beaten a lot. He's been flogged a lot. But in this case, he's kind of going to play this trump card, this Roman citizenship. So there's a lot of discussion about that. Why was Paul a Roman citizen? Because not everybody who lived in Rome's territory was a citizen. You had to be a citizen. And in order to be a citizen of Rome, if you weren't Roman, you didn't really come from Rome, then generally you had to buy your way into that. And it was expensive. You had to buy your citizenship. So it's not like in the United States, not like in a country where you're there and you acquire citizenship, right? You actually had to buy your citizenship. So a lot of people think that Paul's parents might have bought their citizenship, thereby making Paul a citizen. But because he was a citizen, he had rights under Roman rule. If you weren't a citizen, even though you were in Rome, you didn't have the same rights under Roman rule. So it's kind of like in America, if you get arrested and you're not from here, you're still kind of going to get protection of the American legal system, more or less. But there, that wasn't the case. So that's the reason that you had Paul was beheaded, Peter was crucified. Paul's a citizen. Citizens got beheaded. A lot quicker way to die, right? If there's a better way to die, beheading was a better way to die. So if you were a citizen, you got beheaded. But if you were not a citizen, you were crucified. So even though Paul and Peter were killed very close to one another by Nero, Paul was beheaded, Peter was crucified. That's how come you had that distinction. That's how come Jesus was crucified instead of beheaded, because Jesus was not a Roman citizen. If he had been a Roman citizen, he would have been beheaded. But since he was crucified. So it made a difference. There was a distinction between this. And Paul brings this up here. And the commander said he had to pay a big price, right? But Paul said, I was born a citizen. So that's how come we think that. His parents bought in, paid the price. So this changed things. And it made him where he could appeal to Caesar. Now that was something, we're not quite there yet, but that was something that you could do. since he was a Roman citizen. But of course, Paul was being accused. He ordered the chief priest Sanhedrin to assembly, brought Paul to stand before them. The Sanhedrin is the Jewish courts, and there's 70 seats on the Sanhedrin. And there's one seat they leave empty, and that's called the chair of Moses. So when Jesus says, you seat yourself in the chair of Moses, that's what he was talking about. Moses was the lawgiver, right? In other words, he was accusing them of not just being interpreters of the law, but being givers of the law, making the laws. And that's why Jesus criticized them. And that's why he said, you sat in the chair of Moses. That's what that means when he said that. Because there was an empty chair, that was the chair of Moses, because Moses brought the law. And the Sanhedrin was the Jewish court. And they're who decided matters of Judaism. Now, the Jews could do a lot of things to somebody. Technically, they couldn't kill somebody, although we know that happened in the New Testament. Although they didn't kill Jesus, they brought him before Rome because they couldn't have crucified him. They probably could have got away with stoning him, maybe, because they got away with stoning Stephen, but they couldn't have got away with the crucifixion. So that's how come they had to bring Jesus before Rome. But the Jewish system, they had their own guard, the temple guard. They had their own system of justice that was based along the law of Moses. So there's two different laws here. Law of Moses, law of Rome. So when they went to get Jesus in the garden, most people believe there were Roman guards and there were also Templar guards that went to get Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And most people believe that there were Roman guards and Templar guards at the tomb of Jesus. It's kind of interesting what Pilate says, because you can take it two ways. Remember, they said we need to guard the tomb because he said he's going to rise on the third day. And Pilate says, you have your guard, go make it secure. Now, that can mean two things. It can mean, I've given you a guard, you have your guard right here, Roman guard, go and make the tomb secure. It could also mean, you have a guard, you go make it secure. You see? It can mean two different things. You see? So there's always a little bit of controversy about exactly what went on there. Was it Roman guards at the tomb? Or was it Templar guards at the tomb? Or was it both Roman and Templar guards at the tomb? A lot of discussion. So there's two different groups of people, two different laws, two different means of enforcement, two different guards. So it's kind of confusing. And so this guy wants to know what's going on with Paul. So he's going to bring him before the Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish court. And in the Sanhedrin, there's two groups of people, basically. At the time of Jesus, there's basically four groups of Jews. There's more than that, but four main groups of Jews. There's Pharisees, there's Sadducees, there's Essenes, and there's Zealots. Those are the four big groups of Jews. The Pharisees were the more liberal group. They're the ones, Paul was a Pharisee. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in angels. They took all of the Old Testament, the whole Old Testament canon. They took the prophets. They took poetry. They took all the Old Testament canon. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They were sad, you see, okay? They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's about as good as it's going to get tonight right there. So they didn't believe in that, and there's a lot of discussion about exactly what that means. Do they not believe in eternal life? Do they not believe in the physical resurrection of the dead? Paul kind of brings up they don't believe in the physical resurrection of the body, okay? But a lot of Jews did not believe in eternal life the way you and me believe in it. They did not believe in eternity of the soul. So there's a lot of discussion about that. The Essenes were a very monkish type of group. They didn't marry. They lived in the desert. They baptized in sand instead of water. They got converts or added to their number by basically kidnapping or children or taking orphans and raising them up in their monkish existence. The one thing that the Essenes, though, give us is they give us the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how important discovery that was, that's because of the Essenes. They're the ones who copied that, buried it in the desert, and eventually it was uncovered in the desert, but that was the work of the Essenes. They were very monkish. They were very studied. They were very seclusionist. They stayed to themselves. They lived in the desert. That was the other group. Now, the other group was the zealots, however you want to pronounce it. And they were the ones who were intent on overthrowing Rome. Now, if you remember right, one of Jesus's apostles, interestingly enough, was a zealot, right? Simon the Zealot. So one of Jesus, and I always thought that was fascinating. And I always wondered what the discussions they had with him were around the campfire, because he had to have a whole different view than most of them about all this. But one of his apostles was a zealot. And the zealots are the ones who wanted to overthrow the Roman government, and eventually they are the ones who would start the revolt in 71 AD that would eventually destroy Jerusalem. That was the work of the zealots. So they were more military. They wanted to overthrow Rome in a military sense. They were looking for a Messiah who was going to be a military leader who's going to help them to overthrow Rome. So you have four big groups. But of those groups, the two that we talk about most in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because those are the two that were in the temple. The high priest was a Sadducee, was always a Sadducee. The high priest was a Sadducee. And so you have two groups, and both of these groups were represented in the Sanhedrin, in the group of the Sanhedrin. So that was a Jewish court, and these two groups are represented in this court. And so they brought him before them you got to go to the next one. So they brought him before the Sanhedrin, to try him. What are you accusing him of, right? What's the accusation? The Roman commander wants to know, because is it against Rome? If it's against Rome, then the Romans need to be involved, right? But if it's just in Judaism, then, well, that's their problem, right? We don't care. So what's the charge, right? What did he do wrong? What's the charge? So we have to get into that a little bit. So Paul said he's fulfilled, and I think that's a really important statement. He says, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. So as far as Paul is concerned, he was in good conscience when he stoned Stephen, right? He was in good conscience when he went to Damascus. He was in good conscience the whole time. He totally believed what he was doing. He believed he was right. He believed he was doing the right thing all the time. And also when he was converted to Christianity. Paul says, basically, my conscience was clear. All the time I was doing whatever I was doing, my conscience was saying this is what I needed to do. I've done it to this day, he said. Now, Ananias, so that's confusing in the Bible, because we talk about Caiaphas being the high priest, we talk about Ananias being the high priest. They're brother-in-laws. And the reason that is because in Jewish law, a high priest served until death. The only way a high priest served, and when he died, that his son would become high priest. That's how this worked. But unfortunately, by the time of the New Testament, by the time Rome had become involved, Rome linked themselves into Judaism, because the Romans thought the best way to control Jerusalem and Judea is to get along with the Jews. They didn't want to rule the Jews. They wanted the Jews to be happy. So Herod builds the temple. We call it Herod's temple. And that started before Jesus was even born, and it continued after Jesus' death. Herod's temple, we call that, because Herod rebuilt the whole temple. It's magnificent. He spent tons of money on it because he wanted to appease the Jews. It's not because he cared about the Jews. He wanted to appease the Jews. So the Romans had spent all this money, spent all this time. They had made all these, I guess you would call it, gifts into Judaism. And because of this, they wanted to control the Jews. And the best way to do that was to control the high priest. So, because the high priest was the leader of the Jews. Matter of fact, Paul's going to say that in a minute. The high priest was the leader of the Jews. So what the Roman government did is they started appointing the high priest, whoever they could control politically. So because of that, there's basically in the New Testament, we see Caiaphas being high priest, right? And we see Annas being high priest. It just depends on where you're at in this whole thing. So Ananias is high priest here. And see, we had Annas high priest, we had Caiaphas high priest, we had Ananias high priest. And that's probably one reason why Paul gets here. He goes, I didn't know he was the high priest. You know, people say, well, how will Paul not know that, right? How would he not know it's the high priest? Well, because it kept changing, right? You know, it kept changing. And so when he gets to this point and he says, the high priest, he ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. And Paul says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sat there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, you dare to insult God's high priest? And Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize he was a high priest. It is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. I think it's like Exodus 22. Then Paul said, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he called in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. So Paul uses this to his advantage. And I always read this, and I'm like, you know, Paul's in there. They're supposed to be focusing on Paul. But like I said, the passion of these people astounds me, right? I mean, these are the same people who were throwing dirt in the air and taking their cloaks off. We talked about that. You know, they've got all this passion, right? And so I just have a hard time even almost wrapping my head around how they were, you know. They were so passionate about it that they forgot about Paul, right? And they just started arguing with each other. You know, they forgot all about Paul. The argument became about the resurrection. Didn't matter if Paul was there or not. And that's just a passion. It demonstrates the passion that these people had. And you know, I like that. I mean, I kind of wish maybe I had that. I don't know that I have that kind of passion, you know. I mean, I think I do, but I don't know that I'm this outspoken about it like they are. It's just amazing how in the Bible we see all these things, you know, these crowds, these riots, these assemblies, throwing dust in the air, gnashing teeth, rending clothes. Man, you know, you see all this stuff going on in the Bible, all this passion. And so you get a parenthetical statement Luke gives you. The Sadducees say there's no resurrection, that they're neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. The Sadducees just took the Pentateuch, we call the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But I still struggle with the idea they don't believe in angels, because if you remember right, in Genesis, Jacob saw the angels, right, ascending and descending from heaven on a ladder. We call it Jacob's ladder. So it always amazes me that they don't believe in angels. They don't believe in spirits. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in any of those things. And yet they're very passionate about God. Always kind of amazed me, right? And so I thought, well, you know, I really don't understand Judaism as well as I sometimes want to. So I thought, you know, I would study on that a little bit. And the big problem you have is that these groups don't exist today. They're no longer these groups of Jews. This doesn't exist. There's no Sadducees, no Pharisees. Doesn't exist anymore. Hadn't existed in thousands of years. So it's hard to say exactly what these groups did or didn't. Most of what we know is here and then in Josephus Flavius' histories, that a little bit here and there about them. We don't know much about them, really, except for what you read here. So we can't really ask them, you know, well, what did you really believe? Or what did you not really believe? We can't really do that. So what you can ask is, what do Jews believe now about eternity, about what we would say heaven, right? But I don't think a Jew would use the word heaven, number one. What do they think about eternity, the eternity of the soul? I often read this, and I'm like, well, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the body, but did they believe in the eternal soul? Did they believe in, you know, that the soul was eternal? So I thought, well, so I started reading some stuff from some rabbis, you know, which is because we got Google now, so we can read everything, right? And you should always believe everything Google says because it's right. And so I was reading about this really interesting, kind of an interesting situation, because this lady who was fairly young, she's in her 30s, her husband died in a car accident, and she was Jewish. And the particular rabbi where she was in synagogue, he basically said, Well, it's all done deal. In other words, you're never going to see him again. There's no eternity of the soul. There's no eternal life. He's just dead. Well, she was kind of upset by that because, she was a young lady, lost her husband. And so she had a friend who was a Christian. And the Christian friend was like, well, there's eternity, there's heaven, you can see your husband again. You know how we are. You know how Christians are, right? Even though we might think they're Jews, but we're still going to say that, right? You're going to see your husband again and all this. And so the lady kind of gets a little confused. She's like, well, why do you believe that there's this resurrection, eternity, and yet my rabbi, says that this is all there is. All there is this life, nothing else. So she goes to this, I can't remember this guy's name, but he's kind of a big-time rabbi, and he was in like Minneapolis. So she goes to this big-time rabbi, and she says, what do we believe? What do you really believe? And he basically said, well, there's like 32 different philosophies in Judaism about the afterlife, basically. And but he would not tell her that the soul's eternal. He wouldn't say that. But what he said was, he said, what's alive will remain alive. So basically he was saying if the soul's eternal and the soul's alive, it will remain alive. But he wouldn't go as far as to say what that meant, where that was, or any of that. So in Judaism today, to the best of my knowledge, and like I said, I'm no expert in Judaism, but to the best of my knowledge, a lot of Judaism today, what I read, the bulk of Judaism today, does not believe in an afterlife, does not believe in eternity of the soul. So that kind of maybe goes back to this a little bit. I don't know. I'm just kind of telling you what I've kind of looked at, because I find it very fascinating that you could be so zealous for God, so fervent for God, so all about God, and yet think there's no life after this, right? Because for a Christian, we always look towards eternity as our goal, as our hope, as what drives us, even when the world's nasty and bad and terrible. We're driven towards that idea of eternity. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around the idea, well, could I serve God if this was all there was? Now, of course, Paul would say in Corinthians, he would say, if we have hope in Jesus and this life only, we're of all men most to be pitied, right? We're of all men most to be pitied. So just interesting to me as I go through this and look at this Jewish philosophy and Paul's philosophy. So the Sadducees believed in this resurrection. Now, in the Old Testament, there's not much talk about not much talk about resurrection in the Old Testament, right? If you've really read the Old Testament, there's not a whole lot of talk about any kind of resurrection. So it's kind of interesting that they believe in this bodily resurrection. I don't know exactly where they get that theology, but that's apparently what Paul says. The teachers of the law who are Pharisees argued vigorously, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, right? What if he's got some revelation that we don't have? But the Sadducees, of course, didn't believe in angels, didn't believe in spirits, didn't believe in the resurrection. The dispute became so violent, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. I always wondered, did they have a hold of him, like pulling both directions in this thing, he's ours, no, he's ours, right? I don't know. I don't know how that went down, but he was afraid for his life. And so he took him back to the barracks, and Paul said, take courage, you've testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome, which is kind of puts that idea in Paul's head about appealing to Caesar. The next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy, bound themselves not to eat or drink until they had killed him. More than 40 men were involved. We've taken a solemn oath not to eat or drink until we've killed Paul. This is also very interesting to me because they're not going to kill him. So I wondered, did they starve to death? I just don't have the answers to these questions. It drives me nuts, right? So, if you don't kill him and you took an oath, then, I don't know, I guess you starved to death. I don't know how that works, right? But he said that they find out about it because, and this is where you see a little bit of Paul's family coming in, the son of Paul's sister. He told him, and of course they let it be known. And when they did, they decided that, well, the best thing they were going to do is they were going to take him because he's a Roman citizen and because he has a protection of Rome. And this is where that kind of comes into play here. He said, we're going to take you with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, and we're going to take you to Caesarea at night. So basically, the Roman commander's like, he's a Roman citizen. I'm going to protect him. I'm not going to put my head on the line over this. We're going to give him a guard. We're going to take him to Caesarea, and we're going to drop him off there. And so we can avoid this situation. So we're going to take him to Felix. And Felix was the governor. And so Felix comes. He goes to Felix, and he said the questions had nothing about their law. There was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. And when I informed the plot, I sent him to you. The soldiers took him with him, brought him. The next day, the cavalry returned with the governor, and he said, I'll hear your case and your accusers get here. So this is one of those cases now where now he's at the place, this governor, Felix, and now Felix is going to hear the case, but he's going to wait for his accusers to get there. Now, these accusers are going to be lawyers, right? Now, in the Bible, in the New Testament, if you remember the situation where Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind. The next is like to it, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you remember that before the story of the Good Samaritan, it was a lawyer who asked him the question, who's my neighbor, right? It was a lawyer, according to the Bible. So the lawyers, like we have lawyers to interpret our law, is that the way I should put that? Shannon's back there. We have lawyers to interpret our law, or to argue our law. So the Jews had lawyers to argue their law, the law of Moses. So he says, we're going to wait for your accusers to get here, and then I'm going to hear your case. So this gets us to, you got to change me, Shannon. Do what now? Yes and no. So, yes, he is. But the Herods were also Jews. They proselyted or converted into Judaism for the most part. So even though the Herods really weren't Jews, they were Jews. We're going to get into that with Drusilla. Right, the Romans were protecting him. He was a Roman governor. He was under Roman protection. So they couldn't just go in and get him. But on the other hand, most of the Herods, and I don't know necessarily about Felix, but when we talk about Drusilla, she was also Jewish. So most of the Herods had actually converted into Judaism. So there was a little bit of a cross deal in there. So they kind of knew the Jewish law too, and they kind of knew the Roman law, but they were bound by Rome to do what Rome required them to do. So kind of an interesting situation. Time doesn't mean a lot here. Just throwing that out there. He's going to be here for a while. I mean, he's going to be here for quite a while. Time is kind of irrelevant at this point. We're going to leave you here until your accusers get here. Pretty well kept him comfortable, what we call house arrest. He's just waiting for them to come up from Jerusalem to accuse him, to make their case. And so in the meantime, he's just kind of hanging out, waiting for that to happen, which gives him time to prepare this, right? So 5 days later, he went to Caesarea. Some of the elders, a lawyer named Tertullus, they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Paul was called in. Tertullus presented his case. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you. That's kind of buttering him up, right? In other words, you've been a really good guy, good ruler. Things have been peaceful. You're excellent, Felix, right? Profound gratitude. We found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, he says. So, we're going to make him out to be a troublemaker. He's a terrorist, right? Right? He's a terrorist. So we're going to have to do something about him because he's causing this problem. He's stirring people up. Can't have that. He tried to desecrate the temple. That's their big thing against Paul. That's what started all this. He brought a Gentile into the temple. That's what their accusation, that's their main charge of the Judaism charge is. You'll be able to learn the truth. The Jews joined in the accusation, certain these things were true. And he says, I know for a number of years you have been a judge, so I gladly make my defense. This is what he says, right? Basically, I didn't do it. Right? He didn't argue. He didn't stir up the crowd. Can't prove that he brought a Gentile in there. Says, I do admit I worship the God of our fathers, which is interesting because he's talking about the God of the Jews, right? But he follows the way, which is what it's called here, the way, which they call a sect. I believe in the law. I have the same hope in God as these men. There will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked, which, of course, the high priest doesn't have that. I love this. This is one of the few places in the Bible, if you know this or not, this is one of the few places in the Bible where we talk about the resurrection of the wicked. We don't hardly ever talk about that in the Bible. Resurrection in the Bible is almost always the righteous. Resurrection of the righteous. Resurrection of the righteous. And we don't really talk hardly any in the Bible, or not very much, about resurrection of the wicked. And yet here Paul says there's going to be a resurrection of the righteous and a resurrection of the wicked. A lot of people today believe that the wicked soul will just be destroyed. And there's some biblical idea of that, some biblical thought of that. You know, Jesus says that the shaft will be burned up with an unquenchable fire, right? If you burn something up, you destroy it, no longer exists. So there's a lot of thought about that today. But here Paul says that the wicked will also be resurrected, not just the righteous. Now, it's interesting in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul talks about the resurrection of the righteous, right? He says the dead in Christ will rise first, and those alive will meet them in the air. Doesn't say anything about the resurrection of the wicked in 1 Thessalonians 4. Of course, the Thessalonians ain't real concerned about the resurrection of the wicked, right? Because they're more worried about the resurrection of the people they love, not the resurrection of the wicked. But here Paul really makes this statement. There'll be a resurrection of the righteous, there'll be a resurrection of the wicked. So to the wicked, do you think the Bible gives the idea that the wicked continue to exist after death? Do you think that's a biblical principle? The wicked continue to exist after death. Remember Lazarus? He says he's able to reserve the ungodly, right, under punishment until the day of judgment, right? 1 Peter 3, Jesus preached to those who are once disobedient in the days of Noah, right? So the Bible is very plain that the unrighteous or the wicked do continue to exist. Now, what happens at judgment, what happens at final judgment, that may be something we could discuss. But the Bible is very plain that the unrighteous as well as the righteous continue to exist after death. Continue to exist. And here Paul says there'll be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. Now when we talk about judgments in the Bible, the sheep and goat judgment of Matthew, right? He says, he'll say to the sheep, right, on my right hand, to the goats on my left, right? So there's the righteous and the wicked. And also in the great white throne judgment, it says that everyone will stand before the throne of God. And also it says that, right, every knee shall bow and every mouth shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Every is in everybody. So I don't know. There's a lot of backup to the idea that, yes, the wicked continue to exist. Yes, the wicked will face judgment. Yes, the wicked will stand before the throne of God. A lot of the Bible really espouses to that idea. So this is not necessarily a new thought, but just don't see it a lot in the Bible. So it's kind of interesting when we get to that point. He says, I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God. I came to Jerusalem, bring gifts to the poor, present offerings. I was ceremonially clean. They found me in the temple. To be ceremonially clean, what does that mean? To be ceremonially clean. Yeah, but what exactly involved in that? Do what? That's right. You had to wash your body. You had to go through a bath. You had to clean your flesh. Yeah, clean clothes. Right? Couldn't have defect. Couldn't be sick. Couldn't be ill. Couldn't have any physical deformity. Right? Couldn't have any of that. If you was a man, you couldn't be emasculated. You had to be the whole thing, you had to be complete. He had to go through this mikveh usually to go into there, but he'd done all that. He had done everything required. He was ceremonially clean to go in. They accused him of bringing a Gentile in. Paul denies that he did that. Paul denies that he brought a Gentile into the court. There was no crowd, nor was I involved in disturbance. Those are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. It's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. Now that's what Paul says. Now they would disagree. But Paul says it's because of the resurrection of the dead. So when he said there's a resurrection of the dead, that's what caused the outbreak. That's what made him go to Felix. So Paul says because of that, that's why I'm on trial here before you today, because I espouse to the resurrection of the dead. And Paul does so many places. 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, huge passages about the resurrection, right? And so Paul really talks a lot about it. It's a big thing to him. I would rather be absent from the body and present with the Lord, right? Or in this body we groan, longing to be clothed, right, with our heavenly dwelling, Paul would say. So Paul's really big about this idea of the resurrection. Maybe we see it more here than we do any place. From Paul, more than anybody else in the Bible, for sure, we see this idea of bodily resurrection, physical resurrection. So it's really a big thing to him, and that's why he says that he's there. Felix is well acquainted with the way, because this has been going on for a lot of years now. And so he understands. He says, when Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. So he gave him freedom, what we call house arrest, permit his friends to take care of his leads. And then Drusilla comes along. Felix came with his wife Drusilla. Drusilla is such an interesting historical character. You know the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right? You know about Pompeii, right? Pompeii that's all covered in ashes and dirt. That was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And Drusilla is one of the few named people that we know that was killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, what destroyed Pompeii. And also her child, who was Felix' son, who was an Agrippa, he was also killed in the destruction of, in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So, kind of interesting. I always thought that was kind of an interesting historical little tidbit in there. I always kind of liked that. So he came with his wife Drusilla. Now, Drusilla wasn't originally married to Felix. Drusilla was actually espoused to someone else. It was kind of a marriage of political influence. Can't remember the guy's name. It's eluding me right now. He was not a Jew, but he agreed to be circumcised to marry Drusilla. And so he was circumcised, poor guy, to marry her, and then she winds up running off with Felix, right? And she has a child with Felix, and then Felix and then her and the child both get killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So I always think she's kind of an interesting character. But she was a Jew, or proselyted to Judaism, and that's how come the guy that she was going to marry before this had to be circumcised. Felix, on the other hand, was not. So kind of an interesting marriage here. She was very pretty, and he was taken with her beauty. They think that she was probably around 22 years old when she appeared here, and apparently a very beautiful woman. And he was quite taken with her beauty and decided that kind of whatever the case, it's kind of an interesting letter that it still exists that he wrote to her, because he made the case that he was going to be her husband because he was taken with her appearance, taken with her beauty. So I always thought she was kind of an interesting historical nugget in the middle of Acts. Who was a Jewess, and he says that there, sent for Paul, listened to him as he spoke about faith. Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, the judgment to come. Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So for 2 years, Paul sits there and talks to him and goes on. As I said, time seems to be irrelevant, right? He's under house arrest. He's all protected. He's fed by the Roman government. And so he stays in there. He makes his case for 2 years. And then whenever Felix leaves, he decides, well, I'll do a favor, and I'm just going to leave him in jail. So he just leaves him in jail. You know, over and over as you look at the story of Paul, which we're about out of time, but over and over as you read this story, you think, there's all these places where Paul could have been released, right? I mean, he could have been released in Rome by the government there, could have been released by Felix, 2 years could have been released. It says he wanted a bribe. Paul probably knew he wanted a bribe. Could have bribed him, got released, right? But Paul was focused on going to Rome. And this was a way that he was going to do it, was to stay under this Roman, you could say, imprisonment, or these Roman path to get to Caesar. And he's basically, next time we'll talk about, he's going to appeal to Caesar, go to Caesar. He's going to go to Rome on the tab of the Roman government. So it's kind of interesting, I think. So anyway, I hope you're enjoying this, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for your time.